Okay, so thanks everyone for being here. And so I'm going to talk to you today about a very unique and not very widespread, geographically constrained ecosystem that's found in the southern part of India, the Shola forest grassland ecosystems that occur in the mountain tops of the southern Western Ghats of India. But before I just go, before I show you where it is, I've got to tell you that as a person from Tamil Nadu, calling it a Shola forest grassland ecosystem is really funny for me because the word Shola in my native language, Tamil, means forest. So I'm going to talk to you today about the forest grassland ecosystems of India. Okay, now, so where are we in the world? Here we are, and can you see my cursor? Well, here we are in India, and you can see here today's Landsat image. There's Cyclone Nivar. It just made landfall in southern India yesterday. So as we speak, it's going to be pouring in the Shola grasslands that we're going to be talking about. And where are these Shola grasslands? Well, they occur in the Western Ghats of India, which, as you probably all know, is this long mountain chain that runs down the western spur of the Indian peninsula, and which is one of Earth's biodiversity hotspots. It contains within it many habitats, and one particular one of them is the Shola forest grassland ecosystem, which is found only in the southern part of the Western Ghats at the mountaintops. And today we're going to be speaking about one of the Shola grassland landscapes in the southern Western Ghats, one of the biggest ones. If you can look at that map, all those red areas are basically the Shola grasslands. And as you can see, what I was telling you, it's already a very geographically constrained habitat. And of course, with all the land use change that takes place in a crowded developing country like ours, it is diminishing all the time. So what do these ecosystems look like? Well, if you're very lucky and you happen to walk into a pristine part of the Shola grassland ecosystem, you would be confronted with a vista like this. Not only are they ethereally and otherworldly beautiful, but as an ecologist, if you look at this ecosystem, there are some very peculiar characteristics. For one, you know, something that we're not very, that we don't think about very often, you've got forests and grasslands jostling together in the same landscape. This, of course, is quite against the one climate, one biome paradigm. They are spatially very distinct, but importantly, if you look closely there, you can see that the boundaries between the two states, the dark sholas and the lighter colored grasslands, are very abrupt. Now, these are not just very beautiful systems, they're also nestled within a biodiversity hotspot and themselves contain very many endemic and rare species. And let me just first walk you through a sort of a picture tour of the Shola forest. Here's another view of the Shola if you were walking along the mountaintops. They are very important, not just from a biodiversity perspective, but at these mountaintops, they provide very important hydrological services for the plains because most of the rivers of South India originate in these ecosystems. If you're very lucky and you happen to be walking through the Shola in one of the 12 years, in one of the, 12 years when the Kurinji, which is the purple flower that you see here flowering, that is an endemic. It's a strobilanthes, it's endemic to this ecosystem. And in fact, it's the reason the place that I work in gets its name. We're going to be talking about the Nilgiri Plateau, and the Nilgiri is basically, in the vernacular, it means blue mountains, and it gets its name from the profuse flowering of the Kurinji once every 12 years. I haven't seen it myself yet, and certainly hope to see it someday. Something like this endemic, the Nilgiri pipit, which is a grassland bird. It's a grassland specialist, and it doesn't occur anywhere else. It's endemic. Likewise, you have other endemics like the Shola kili, which is endemic to the Sholas, some rhododendrons, and southern India's only mountain. So these are really very important ecosystems, but very small in the geographical spread that they occur on. And today, in the 2000s, we know that these are actually very ancient ecosystems. And this has been shown by work from Rajagopalan and Sukumar et al., where they basically took cores in peat bogs in these ecosystems, and basically they looked at carbon dating and the relative composition of C3 and C4 vegetation, basically the grassland and the forest. And what their data show are that these ecosystems have been around for a very long time, at least 40 years, and they were present well before human habitation. That becomes important later, as you'll see. But and we know this today because there were people studying it with some very modern tools, but this was not the case in the early 1800s, when the British foresters who occupied this landscape from the 1800s to the mid 1900s happened upon this landscape. And so what I'm going to talk to you about in the first part of my talk really is the first 150 years of the history of the Shola grasslands. What happened to them when people came in who were trying to use these landscapes and trying to farm in them and having agriculture, etc. in them, and how that transformed the landscape in the next 100 years. So I'm very quickly going to go through that. This is an archival study done by Joshi et al. Basically we use the documentation at the India Archives in London, in the British Museum in London. British Library, sorry. Okay, so 1818, the British discover the Shola grassland mosaic. In fact, they acquired the Nilgiri plateau late 1790. The East India Company acquired it, but for whatever reason, you know, nobody really came up there and recognizes the landscape till 1818 when somebody came up. And this gentleman here, Mr. John Sullivan, in the corner, is basically the first European who built his house there, and he settled there. And he found the environment very cool and salubrious. And he really pushed for the British government at that time, for the colonial government at that time, to settle the Nilgiris and to bring in a number of people in there. And in particular, he suggested that it might be a very good place for soldiers who were not feeling very well to recuperate. Okay, and by the 1820s, then we started having the construction of roads and buildings in this landscape. And also at the same time, we had a lot of foresters who came in and who started thinking about how to manage this landscape. And just like when you saw that photograph of the Shola grassland, and you know, you really wonder what it is that allows these two different ecosystems to exist in the same space, which is modern terminology. But I think in the 1800s, the first visitors to the Nilgiris had very similar thoughts. Here is a painting of the Uttakaman Plateau by Baiki in 1834. And here then is what Sir Thomas Munro, the governor of the Madras Presidency, said about the landscape in 1826. They, the hills, are as smooth as the lawns in an English park, and there's hardly any one of them which has not a mass of dark wood terminating suddenly as if it had been planted. Now, if you examine this text, there's a lot of things in it. First, clearly, the plateau was reminiscent of home. And when you use words like it's as smooth as the lawns in an English park, clearly it was aesthetically pleasing. There was some of that. But here at the end, the interesting idea that the dark wood terminating suddenly as if it had been planted, suggesting that even while it looked very beautiful, something about it just didn't look very natural to the viewer. And as they saw this landscape and how it looked, they also had to confront the fact that this landscape, in fact, had been occupied by indigenous people for a very long time. And here you have a sketch from 1837 of one of the tribes that was indigenous to the Nilgiri plateau at that time, the Todas. They are cattle bearers. They have cattle that they walk around in, that they walk around the plateau with, that they graze the plateau with. There are also 3 or 4 other tribes who were there at that time. There were basically agriculturists, there were hunter-gatherers, there were some sort of tool makers. So a whole bunch of tribes were already there. The population was not very dense, But even as they were thinking about this landscape and how it looked so odd, they also then were looking at these people who lived there and farmed and grazed in these landscapes. And here's another drawing, and here you can see the Todas walking with their cattle in the landscape. And not surprisingly then, here you have H.P. Grigg saying, although much later, there are earlier quotes, but for some reason I couldn't find it today, it is, however, to be remembered that the present park-like appearance of the higher plateau with its downs and woodlands is also in a great measure due to the annual recurrence of fires which sweep over the hills. Periodical fires and the grazing of the buffaloes help to keep this line distinct. And he's talking about that line, that sharp line between the Shola and the grasslands. Okay, so what I'm going to quickly walk you through then is the timeline of what happened. So it was now already a couple of years since the British had come to the plateau. In 1820s, small-scale experiments with exotic species on the grasslands. Recall that, you know, they thought that the grasslands were only there because of the grazing and fires. By 1840s, there was a lot of experimenting with coffee and tea plantations. 1856, by 1856, about 30 years after they settled the plateau, basically the population had really grown. And with the growth of this population came a demand for fuel wood. And in order to meet that demand, it became very clear to the foresters who were there that what they would have to do is basically put down a number of plantations. And that began in earnest then in 1856. And here's an interesting thing. They actually tried some of the native Shola species. They tried doing plantations with them, but many of them failed. And then they abandoned them. At the same time, exotic acacia and eucalyptus species that were brought in and planted thrived, as in they survived. They did better than the Shola trees. But generally, you know, compared to other plantations in the plains, the foresters were not satisfied with the kind of growth that they were getting in the plantations on the plateau. These plantations have not hitherto made the progress expected of them, says H.R. Morgan, the conservator of forests in 1861. And then Bedomi, the next conservator of forests, says, well, it's owing to the ground having been planted indiscriminately without attention to soil and situation. They have a cost far more than they ought to have had. And many thousand Australian trees were put down in the Shola last year, but the Todas, buffaloes, have committed very great havoc amongst them. So the longer they were there, the more convinced they were that much of what was happening had to do with the, the grazing and the tree felling and the fires that were routine practices of the indigenous people of the Nilgiri Plateau. As time went on, more things started to happen. The acacia species started to turn invasive. The plantations on the plateau were consistently incurring economic losses. And finally, if you look at the timeline between 1838 and 1930, so 2 years short of a century that the foresters were there, they experimented with 35 different exotic species planted in the grasslands. And although there was this constant refrain that the plantations weren't doing that well, they kept doing it. And this really has to do with, their misreading of the ecosystem. They were just convinced that the grasslands were meant to have trees. And so even though the trees weren't doing that well, somehow the idea that perhaps the trees were not supposed to be there never really crossed anybody's mind. But it was very clear that the acacia had become invasive. And here we have the conservator of forests in 1894 saying it's a questionable policy to extend the growth of Acacia dealbata, the yellow wattle, anywhere, as it is an unmixed nuisance in many places from its habit of throwing up rootsucker. And finally, in 1924, around the time that, it was 1 century in, Richmond, the secretary to the government of the Madras presidency, says the fact that the sixth circle, which refers to the Nilgiri Plateau, which contains the largest area of valuable timber, was the only circle to show a deficit, suggests that there must be some radical deficit in the past system of work. And that was kind of the history of what happened over the 100 years that the British were there and tried to practice silviculture, as it were, in this landscape. And just to give you a visual on what that looked like, here we are. This is the monument there is the St. Stephen's Church, and this I think is an image in 1824. Here we are in 1851. Around the church, you can see that the plantations have started to take hold. You can see more trees in the landscape. By 1905, you're seeing mostly trees. The grassland has disappeared. And here's what it's looked like in 2014. And you can see that as a montage there. So clearly, the tree planting had really taken off. And in 100 years, it had really dramatically transformed the landscape. Well, shortly after that, India gained independence. And what happened after that? Well, more of the same. The Forest Department in newly independent India, in fact, took to tree planting with, 10 times more zealousness than the British foresters before them. They accelerated tree planting in the Nilgiris manyfold. And by 1995, the Sholas in the plateau had shrunk by a full 50% and the grassland by 83%, all given over to plantations, mostly of acacia and eucalyptus. And today, if you go to the plateau, this is what it looks like, not like the other image I showed you. Mostly what you're going to see is agricultural lands and lots of plantations. And more concerningly, you will see images like this. Now, this is an interesting image because what you have here, and please contrast it with the first image that I showed you, here you have in bright green a Shola patch. And unlike in the past, when it would have been surrounded by a grassland, what you have here for hillside after hillside are plantations of non-native acacia. And of course, a big point that immediately becomes obvious when you see this photograph as well, the last time I looked, all that was grass. So really, what is going on in this system? Or more specifically, why is it that when you've got native trees and grasslands, the native trees stay spatially segregated from the grassland and don't invade it? And why is it that when you've got these non-native trees, they are able to invade the grassland where the native trees are not? Now, this may seem like we came up with this question, but certainly not, as you would have seen hints of it in the comments from the foresters in the archives. Basically, everyone had been thinking about this for a long time, because that's really the question that comes to your mind when you are walking or living in this ecosystem. And so this question, what is it that maintains the Shola grassland mosaics, has actually a very long history of debate in the literature in this part of the world. Grieg, 1880, as you already saw, he was convinced that periodical fires and the grazing of buffaloes helped to keep this line distinct. So here was the hypothesis: fire or grazing maintain the forest grassland mosaic. Another forester in the early 1900s, Ranganathan, 1938, made a very important observation. He said the relative distribution of the two climaxes, forests and grasslands, is governed by the incidence of frost. So then we have a frost hypothesis. And then here you have Jose and all, who actually building on the work of people like Meher Homji and Ranganathan before them, did some comparisons of the soils across the sholas and the grasses. They seem to be different, and they concluded, hence the assumption the grasslands are steady state vegetation maintained by edaphic factors holds good. So you have a soil hypothesis, okay? But that's correlated, there was no test for it. So what we decided to do, which is basically Atul Joshi, who's done all this work, and was to go out and experimentally try and test these hypotheses, okay? So what did we do? Well, preliminary surveys in the grasslands showed us that there were not very many established young saplings of Shola trees there anyway. So we already knew from walking around the landscape that clearly the limitation must be either at the stage of germination or when the seedlings and saplings are trying to establish, because really you don't see anything past that stage in the grassland already. So we thought the bottleneck probably occurred either the germination or the seedling establishment stage, and Atul set out to test these systematically. And so he asked, do soils and microclimate influence germination? And basically for two species, Syzygium grandi, which is a native, and the Acacia murensii, at 14 replicate sites, several seeds which were planted in both the soil types, the grassland and the shola, and then they were placed in pairs in the grassland, in the shola, and then he tracked the germination of these two, of a native and a invasive, to see what happened. And what did the results look like? Well, turns out that from what we can see, there wasn't any particular effect of soil on germination success. So regardless of whether it was grassland soil or shola soil, the invasive and the native germinated. Interestingly, there was actually greater germination in the grasslands than within the shola patches, though the soil didn't matter. So when they were in the grassland, germination was better. But that was true for both the native and the invasive. And well, not so well, this won't come as a surprise, but the germination success of the invasive acacia was 3 times compared to that of the native species. But overall, the data suggests to us that soil and microclimate weren't exactly influencing germination, and were not doing so directionally differently between the native and the invasive species. Okay, so then perhaps it was the next stage. And so again, for the 2 species, at 2 replicate sites, because now we were working with the seedlings that had germinated in the first experiment. And so we ended up having 10 seedlings per species, per soil type, per microclimate. They were put out in bags like this in the shola, in the grassland, at 2 replicate paired sites, and tracked to see what happened in terms of their survival in this experiment. And now we start to see some really interesting results. So here what you're seeing is on the y-axis, the survival probability, and days on the x-axis. And the native, which is the Syzygium, is in blue, and the red is the acacia. And you can see that in the grasslands, there's drastic overwinter mortality of native seedlings, which is shown by this blue line here, whereas the acacia managed to do pretty all right. Whereas when you do the same thing, look at the same seedlings inside the shola, well, you can see that both of them do better in the shola. In particularly, the native species actually starts to do much better in the shola, and in fact, acacia does just a little less better, survives a little bit less better. Okay, so this gave us a hint that perhaps there was something going on with temperature, and winter temperatures were perhaps having some effect on how native seedlings in particular were able to do in grasslands. And so we measured temperatures across the interface from the forest to the edge and into the grassland. And you can see here, based on these data which were collected with eye buttons placed across this landscape in a couple of different places, that there is a 7 to 10 degrees centigrade difference in temperature over 10 months across the forest grassland boundary. And what you have here is the minimum temperature. So we really thought we really need to explore the idea of temperature more carefully. And we asked the question, do low winter temperatures limit tree establishment in the grasslands? And in order to actually experimentally test this, we did a warming experiment, because the idea was then that if you warmed the system, you should see that bottleneck on germination, on seedling survival disappear. And this year, we were lucky. We managed to get seeds of 5 native species and, of course, acacia. Seeds were collected from the field, germinated in the greenhouse in Bangalore, driven back to the Nilgiri Plateau, and then transplanted into polybags and put out as in this experiment. Basically, we had 2 treatments, warmed and controlled, 3 blocks of each, 4 replicates per block, 4 to 7 individuals per species per replicate. And basically, how did we achieve the warming? Basically, we put these thermal blankets onto the seedlings every night. And this is not me, this is Atul. Basically, for every night through that winter, he literally tucked those seedlings into bed every evening about 5:30 p.m. and went early next morning once the sun was up and the temperatures had risen to remove the covering. And by doing this, we achieved a warming treatment. And exactly what did that temperature differential look like? You can see here the graph across the season, which is basically the winter. So we are starting in November on the x-axis and going through to February. And you're looking at the minimum temperatures in the red lines, which are the warm treatment, and the blue lines, which are the control treatment. And you can see that the blankets consistently raised temperature in the night and warmed the seedlings, except for these 2 nights here. I think they were too windy and the blankets flew away. And on this one night, there was like crazy rain and the team couldn't reach the site. But on average, the number of really cold nights, so the number of nights that it went below 0, as you can see, were really different between the control and the warming treatment. And then I should show you that at this time, if you may not think it at 11 degrees north of the equator and at 1,800 meters, 2,000 meters above sea level, but you do regularly pass on those cold nights. And here are some photographs of the frost. And basically, across that season when we did the experiment, there were 15 frost nights in the control plots and 2 in the warm plots. And what then happened to the seedlings? Well, the data are fairly dramatic and telling. And as you can see here, the blues are the natives and the red is the acacia. In the control, as you can see, following all these, the dots here actually are the frost nights. So, with every frost night, you can see there's a massive drop in the survival of the native seedlings. And by the end of the winter, but when we're coming out into January, most native seedlings have perished. The acacia actually seem to be able to tolerate frost pretty well. And so they do suffer mortality, but they're doing not too bad in the control. But look at what happens when you do nighttime warming. Well, it's good news and bad news. When you warm, the native species achieve much higher rates of survival, suggesting that temperature is indeed a limiting factor for these seedlings. But what happens to the acacia is dramatic because it already did pretty okay even with the frost, but when you warmed it, it achieves almost 90% survivorship. Okay, so I think we have the glimmerings of an answer to what limits tree establishment in these montane grasslands. Our results indicate very clearly, very strongly, that low nighttime winter temperatures and frost impose strong demographic bottlenecks that limit native species establishment in the grasslands. Future warming, which we think is already happening in these mountains, is likely to favor tree establishment overall. And so the Shola would probably spread into the grasslands. And so it would lead to forest expansion. But the bad news is that it is likely to facilitate the invasive species even more and result in a greater invasion of amines of Acacia mearnsii into the remaining grasslands. Okay, so we have at least some answers, and through these experiments we've brought some light onto a debate that had been around for almost a century before Atul did these experiments. So what about the other hypotheses though? What about the Great Fire hypothesis? I mean, we haven't really done anything. We haven't tested fire, so how can we eliminate it? Well, there's something interesting about the chronology of what happens in this ecosystem, which suggests to us that, in fact, fire may not be that important. And that's because the timeline goes like this. You get the southwest monsoons in June or September, and that's when you have the germination. You get the freezing temperatures and frost in October to February, and that is when you get the high seedling mortality. Fires typically take place in February to May, so they come after the frost. And you saw from the data that the frost pretty much kills most of the seedlings, suggesting to us that while fire may kill a few remaining seedlings, it is certainly not a major driver in this ecosystem. And likewise, we haven't tested herbivory, but I should tell you that from the data, from the seedlings that we had, which we had put out in the plantations to look at their survival, we actually didn't record much of any form of herbivory on the seedlings. So while we haven't specifically tested it, we don't think that either fire or herbivory are that important in this system, which is in contrast to a bunch of other such systems where lots of studies have shown that fire and herbivory are key drivers, and frost, where it does occur, may in fact be a secondary or additional driver. But here we are seeing the exact opposite trend. And I think it's also very unusual to find this pattern from, so deep in the tropics. At least before we did the experiment, I don't think it was in my mind that frost could be a major driver of any ecosystem process here in Tamil Nadu at 11 degrees north. Okay, so that brings us back to the Shola ecosystem. So we have some idea now, the question that we set out to ask. We know something about what maintains the forest grassland mosaic. And we also know something about why we are seeing the invaders being so successful and why they are able to invade the grasslands where the native species are not. But this, of course, then leads us to the next question, which is that now that we know all this, and now that we know that the invasives are expanding at such a crazy rate over these grasslands, what can we do, and how can we think about conserving them and going forward from here? And before we do that, let me show you this recent analysis by Arsumani et al. For the same Nilgiri Plateau, looking at land use and land cover change in this region from the 1970s to the 2017s. Remember, I told you that post-independence, in fact, we accelerated, the planting of exotic trees in the landscape. Well, look at these data and please follow the graph. This is the Nilgiris in 1995. Perhaps if you want, you can keep your eye on the maroon blobs, which are really the timber plantations. 1973, hardly there. 1995, 2017. As you can see, an explosion in the plantations. And at the same time, if you look at the light green patches, which are the Shola grasslands, that's how they are 1973, 1995, and here in 2017. It is pretty clear from these data that the Shola grassland is really very rapidly losing its grassland. It's also losing Sholas, but in fact, contrary to what people always think, and in fact, most of the studies in India so far, when people have gone to this ecosystem, everybody's so mesmerized by the Sholas, the grasslands haven't gotten that much attention, but like grasslands all over the world, they are heavily threatened, and they are in fact rapidly disappearing from this landscape, along with all the endemic fauna that they support, and the many endemic plants as well. So I guess what we need to then grapple with the question is, what are we going to do to try and conserve these grasslands? And here I just want to show you this photograph because it's pretty dramatic. Here you've got a very small Shola that has sort of tried to establish itself in this depression here. And what I want to show you here, and this is also relates to the rapid land use change that I just showed you, what you've got here on the mountainside here, this is acacia. This is acacia walking down the slope. Nobody planted it. So those timber plantation areas that you're seeing in that previous dramatic change, not only is it attributable to actual plantations, but in fact, we are looking at the tail end or the explosive end of the invasion of acacia in this landscape, like a lot of invasives that basically take a lot of time to gather speed and then literally take off. We think what we're seeing at the current time is really the acacia at that accelerated end of its invasion into the landscape. And here, basically, these are completely, sort of marching down the grassland entirely on their own. These are not planted. Okay. So we have a big problem ahead of us. And for those of us who love these Shola ecosystems and want to preserve them, what are we going to do? Well, is there the will, political will, and is there the science? And, a lot of activists and conservationists in this part of the world got together and started creating awareness and put some cases in court, etc. And in May 2014, everybody in Tamil Nadu was really happy because there was a headline in the Hindu newspaper, which, well, typically says, state prepares to eliminate aliens from rainforest. Very exciting. But really what it was that the court had asked the forest department to carefully remove the exotics from the Nilgiri plateau. Okay, fantastic news. Conservationists started to celebrate and thought this was great. No more plantations. We're going to get rid of the aliens. But then, of course, there's a twist to the tail. And those of you in the audience who are restoration ecologists will already be familiar with this. It has happened in many grasslands across the world. Whenever you start to do restoration, you get challenges, both old and new. And the old one, which is very well known to most people trying to restore grasslands after the removal of plantations, is that, well, you can go out there and remove the plantation of exotic trees, but that does not guarantee that the grassland is going to come back. What we're seeing here is that the clear cutting of plantations, and the department has started to see it, does not result in grassland revival. Instead, you get a weedy succession of herbs. You get a massive outburst of the invasive tree seedlings, which have basically occupied the seed bank. A lot of these invasive species tend to do that. They flood the seed bank. And in the case of acacia, because it is a nitrogen fixer, what we're finding is that it's also accumulating nitrogen in the soil, which is now fundamentally changing the microenvironment for grasses that are trying to establish there. Because the traditional wisdom is that the grasslands are really more nutrient poor, while the sholas, which are really sitting at the bottom of the katinas, tend to be more nutrient rich. So now you've fundamentally changed a bunch of variables in the landscape, and going back to where you started or reclaiming the grassland is turning out not to be as easy as we thought. And in fact, this is a lesson that is repeating itself across the world. Although people, although we always want to protect and restore forests, it turns out that restoring forests is actually as simple as planting trees and letting them take hold. But in fact, restoring grasslands is much more complicated. And it's not just here. Many systems of the world, grassland restoration becomes very tricky because of all these very close-knit linkages between the grasses, the nutrient cycles, and how the competitive environment changes once you've got a soil seed bank that's flooded with a whole bunch of new seeds. Now, if that was the only twist in the tail, it would be fine, but we've got a completely different one here. And this is thanks to Bob Stewart and Tanya Balker, who are a pair of conservationists. Life really comes full circle. They came from England to India in the mid-1980s, fell in love with the Shola grassland landscape, settled there and worked there, and have been trying to conserve the Sholas in the grassland since then. Well, Bob and Tanya, while the forest department was trying to remove these plantations, were taking, very rigorous notes on what was happening all around them. And they started to notice something which has also been seen in some other systems, which is that the sholas were actually regenerating inside the plantation. So now this complicated the picture. When you remove or clear cut the trees, you do not get back the grassland, but there are many plantations now where we are seeing, a rapid regeneration of shola trees under the plantations. What a gnarly problem. Or is it a blessing? Really, it depends on how you think about it. And there's a lot of debate in the community here, and many people are advocating leaving these sholas alone, leaving these plantations because they're acting as nurseries for the sholas, and basically we can reclaim some shola back. But remember that these were planted on the grasslands, so you're getting them back at the cost of the grassland. Okay, given this complex situation, obviously restoration needs to triage. We need to carefully prioritize where we are most likely to get some gains for the grasslands. And recent work from Arsamani and Robin, who's a colleague of mine, and basically what they are trying to do is prioritize as follows. Here in the image on the top left, you've got basically, a very open and young plantation. So it's kind of very sparse. Here you've got the isolated sort of invasive tree. Here you've got a plantation that's better established than here, but there's still a strong grassy understory. And here you've got grassland with the beginnings of, saplings of invasive trees coming in. And Arsamani, Bunyan and Robin recommend that restoration tries to focus its efforts on such parts of the landscape because you're likely to be able to control the invasions there, and you might see better gains in terms of trying to get your grassland back in such places. And of course, they're saying, and I'm not sure I agree with them, but they're suggesting that we leave the plantations where the sholas are growing underneath alone to let the shola come back. And this is hot off the press. It's in bioRxiv. Arsamani has also gone ahead and mapped the Nilgiri Plateau with respect to these different areas, such as intact grasslands, sparse exotic trees, lightly invaded trees, etc., as a prioritization exercise to work then with the forest department to try and direct restoration efforts where they are likely to be most successful. So I'll stop with that. And I really want to dedicate this talk to Rob and Tanya, Bob and Tanya, who basically, they spent the past 35 years in this ecosystem trying to work for its conservation. And I'll come back to that in a minute. But I'd also then like to thank a number of other people in my lab and my colleagues who, all of us together are really interested in trying to see what we can do for these ecosystems. I mean, the Shola grassland ecosystems are very interesting ecosystems. You can't work in them and not fall very deeply in love with them. They're very ethereal, they're very beautiful. And, if we can't save something that beautiful, honestly, I don't know what we can do. And before I take questions, what I'd like to do today is really play you all a film, and I'll ask Yadvinder to play it. Our colleagues, the group of people who work here in the Shola grasslands, Prasenjit Yadav in particular, made this film for Tanya, who passed away 4 years ago. And it's very poignant because last month, September, 4 years to the date, and during the lockdown, Bob passed away. And with them, that's 35 years of, what's that called? Conservation in place, place-based conservation that goes with them. Yadvinder, if you could play that.
Thank you, Jayashree. If you stop sharing your screen, I'll...
Yeah.
Okay. Let's try and find it. There, I'll get full screen.
Shola is a very ancient forest type that mainly keeps to the valleys and to the edges. And then in between there's grasslands, which are extremely biodiverse. They're such an important ecosystem, so special, only found in the southern Western Ghats. And just to be honest, it's beautiful.
It also has very high water retention ability, which means that the habitat soaks in a lot of water and lets it out through a very long period of time. In fact, most of the South Indian rivers originate in the Shola habitat.
%87% of the plateau was covered by grasslands. Now we're down to very few small isolated pockets. The British started it. Most of our grasslands, which they considered at that time as wastelands, They planted some experimental plantation trees, exotic species, to see if they could make some income and to give the local people firewood. It's mainly acacia, eucalyptus, and pine. They are all over the plateau and is going very quickly. The existing grasslands are very slowly being invaded by other woody species.
It's not just that the habitat is going, but the entire ecosystem for many species, many perhaps undiscovered species, is also being lost by the loss of this grassland. The grassland species are as important, if not more, than the forest species. The negri pipit, the endemic bird in this landscape, the grassland bird, has actually gone locally extinct from some of these habitats because the grasslands have gone extinct from there as well. This is a big revelation for me, and in terms of policy, that is something to be thought about.
Nobody's planting trees in the grasslands today, but what's happening is that some plantations are also spreading into the montane grasslands. They're in danger of being taken over by eucalyptus, wattle, pine going into that. Clear felling a plantation brings about all kinds of ecological problems. When you clear fell it, you get a whole variety of weeds. We've seen that recently. There's many places in Kodi and in the Palni Hills where weeds have taken over areas that have just been logged 2 years ago. Not just weeds, but also then wattle trees, eucalyptus coming back at an even greater density than they were before.
So I think it was a misguided notion that the plantations could be removed and therefore the grasslands could be brought back. But that's no longer feasible, no longer possible. All the plantations should be basically left alone, make sure that the spread doesn't happen. In some cases, you might be able to push the plantations back a bit from existing grasslands. The Sholas are very strong, they can look after themselves, but the grasslands are such a special ecosystem. So grasslands should be saved because of their extraordinary biodiversity, and there is twice as many species in the grasslands. Everything should be directed at saving them, restoring them. Save our last remaining 15%, roughly, of grasslands.
Okay, thank you. Great, very powerful movie as well. Very nice to see that. Okay, great. So thank you, Jayashree. That was terrific. I encourage everyone to, we can move on to questions now. I encourage everyone to switch on their cameras and microphones. It's always nice to have a real visual audience, if it's okay for you. I think it's nice to make it a bit more real. So first thing is, let's unmute and give Jayashree a round of applause.
Yeah, right.
Create as much a reality as possible with these things. Okay, great. So now we can move on to some questions. And there's a few popping up in the chat box that I'll move to. So when I ask questions, I encourage you to unmute and directly ask the question yourself. It's not, if there's a problem for any reason, just indicate, and I can channel those questions. Actually, I'll just kick off though. Jayashree, you mentioned that there are these traditional indigenous peoples and users of that ecosystem. So how have they been affected by this retreat of the grasslands? Are they still dependent on that ecosystem, and how do they feel about these shifts and issues around that?
Yes. Oh, thanks for asking me that. They went through a very a dramatic transformation when the plantations were really being pushed by in the later part of the colonial rule, and many of them actually lost their traditional livelihoods and became day workers in the plantation. And this is what typically happens. It's not a new story. And in the time since then, they have also now been much more absorbed by the forest department and other government departments. So they are straddling some middle line where they have some of their traditional ways going. But of course, as with many such communities in India, the aspirations of the younger generations are in fact different, and they are already looking to become more part of the mainstream. So, but you still have the Todas, who I showed you in those, who were sketched in those paintings, and who are the most prominent tribe. There's a resurgence of movement among the Todas, where they're really trying to keep all their culture alive, and they are still very strongly cultural and trying to make it work. Yeah.
And just to follow up from that, your talk highlights the important role of frost and microclimate in shaping and determining the Shola. So did the traditional indigenous stewardship or use of those lands, did that have any consequences, either positive or negative, for the biodiversity? Is there a sense of that? So, the buffalo grazing and other components?
Good. I don't have the answer to that, Yadvinder. Don't know. We'd have to really design studies, etc., to look at it. But definitely, in the old time, they never, the densities weren't high. So this entire plateau of more than, a little over 3,000 square kilometers, there were some 2,000, 3,000 of them, like in the, start of the 1900s. It's not a very populous group, unlike many others in India.
Okay, thanks. Okay, I'll take some of the questions from the chat box now. So Shyam, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, thank you, Yukundar. Jayashree, it's a nice talk. I am, as a seed ecologist, unfortunately, very few seed ecologists who are working in India. It is unfortunate we are taking our forest department, our forest officer, they are running behind these massive plantations drive. They are converting not only the Shola, even the Himalayan grasslands, they are planting them, especially with the pine forest and removing the oak forest and pine forest, or like that. My question is here, when I was looking at your seed ecology related experiment, first the acacia is belong to the Fabaceae family, and they must have a physical dormancy, and physical dormancy need to be break either very high temperature or very low temperature. The frost may help to break the physical dormancy as well as very high temperature. So they are definitely going to be benefited when they are in a grasslands, because the grasslands, they have a high temperature fluctuations. And second, they are going to make a very good soil seed bank. They also got benefited by the smoke or smoke water, because the acacia love to have germinations have to be enhanced by through the smoke or smoke related environmental cue. And the native species may have a physiological dormancy that need to be stratified during the winter, or the warm stratified during the rainy seasons, that may be not they are getting. And third, the dispersal, because the grasslands, due to these, we have known these grazers are no more there. These fragmented grasslands may be not getting the seed dispersal, the long-term seed dispersal, because there is no more animals. So they are not, the real native species not dispersing. That's why these grasslands are taken by these invasive species. And the constant temperature versus the alternate temperature may play a big role. Apart from that, the nitrogen fixation, the high nitrogen fertility is one of the major cause of the biodiversity degradations in European calcareous grasslands. And that is going to be happening more or less here also. So I would suggest we need a more seed ecological study in Shola grasslands, so then we know the better, rather than focusing on the adult plant, we need to more research on their seed ecological aspects.
Okay.
Definitely, I hope somebody should do that.
Yeah, if anyone can, I can ready to collaborate. If anyone is willing to take, or any PhD students or something like that.
Okay. Thank you. So really interesting points there. Okay, so Caroline, you got a couple of questions. Nice to see you. Would you like to ask
Hi,
those?
Caroline.
Hey, hi, nice to see you. Thanks for
see
the talk. Hey, so like lovely talk, and the seedling experiment across the boundaries is so fabulous. And I guess, you know, like Shan just raised about the N fixing, I was wondering how many N fixes are in the like woody species in the Shola, and whether or not there's a role for dynamics there as well, relative to Mearnsii being so invasive.
Right. I don't think there are many N-fixers at all, Caroline.
Okay.
But I mean, I can't be sure, but I should look up the list. We've got like 78 species or whatever, but no major N-fixers. Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
I feel like, you know, we've talked about it before. There's a lot of comparability with the Central Highlands of Madagascar, where the dynamics are the same. Mearnsii invading at a rate of knots, and like, what can we figure out about these processes? So it's just so to see your work. And then,
I mean, this is I guess this is in deep South India, but very typical for many places across the globe. In what's happening.
that's cool. And then, if I'm allowed to ask my other question, Yadvinder,
Go ahead.
which was just about whether or not people had done work on the catchment hydrology relative to tree invasion in the Western Ghats.
Very much, very much. There's a group led by Jagdish Krishnaswamy at A-Tree, and they've been catchmenting a whole bunch of the streams, basically downstream of grassland, downstream of plantation, and you will not be surprised to hear that stream flow is really reduced downstream of the plantations because these guys guzzle up the water. And and that's why losing the grasslands at this rate is a huge compromise for the hydrological services provided by this ecosystem downstream.
Thank you. I'm going to get into references for that.
Okay.
Just drawing on your experience in Madagascar, Caroline, this issue of the plantations, getting rid of the plantations, not facilitating the return of the grassland. Is that a similar issue in Madagascar, and are there any solutions or lessons that have been learned there about how to deal with it?
Madagascar might not be emotionally at that point of considering taking out plantations, but putting many more in. Mm-hmm. So it is not something that's been considered that much. And there's a raft of work to be done associated with hydrology and diversity to kind of, I think, highlight the value of those grasslands and what services they're providing to people now before anything happens about taking plantations out.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great, thanks. Paulina, you have a couple of questions. One seems to be you're channeling a question from Manfred there as well. Would you like to ask?
Yeah, exactly. We can do together.
Okay, great.
So, Jayashree, first, thank you for this very interesting and fascinating talk. I'm very glad to see other places in the world which are so similar to our study site. We are doing work in Angola and Africa. And on the Central Plateau, we have a very similar landscape with a very small scale mosaic of grasslands and woodlands. However, in our case, it's inverted. So we have the valleys, which are full of grasslands, and the woodlands are covering the hill ridges. So it's the other way around. And what I would like to know is if your grasslands are also so full of geoxiles, so these dwarf shrubs with massive underground woody structures.
Oh. Well, we haven't done the work, but some preliminary digging around does suggest that there are quite a few of them with the geophytic structures.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Because we have also very frequent frost events in our system, and it's I think just like at your site, that first comes the frost and then later on the fire. So it's nice to see those parallels. So for
That's amazing. But then why are your forests on the hilltops?
I think this is something what Manfred can tell you. This is related to his question.
Yeah, it's quite my topic. Normally, cold air in the night cools down, so you have cool air pooling in the valley bottoms, at least in Angola. And I was wondering why you have the forest patches in the valleys where normally you'd expect the cold air to pool. So isn't it the coldest patch, and why are the forests conserved there in the lowest part and not on the ridges where it should be a bit less exposed to frost? So maybe the mechanisms of frost are a bit different in your systems than in our, but yeah, do you have an explanation?
Oh, we need to look at the patterns of the frost and the temperature across the two things to see what's happening. We need to compare that.
Just to offer some perspective on that, different perspective, we've done some work in the Andean high elevation grasslands in Peru, and there, because it's a very sloping structure, like at least some of the photos that Jayashree was showing, the cold air runs down the valleys, but doesn't pool there, it goes further down. So I'm not sure whether, and there, in that case, if you're in a slight recess, you have slightly more radiative sheltering, so you get less radiative loss to the sky, but the cold air is running through and further down. And I don't know whether your Angolan context is more like a flat plateau with depressions. Yeah, you would get pooling of air. So maybe the broader scale topography and the role of slopes in that, and that may make a difference in frost dynamics.
Yes, I think that the topography really does matter to where you get the frost, right? The details of that. Yeah, maybe we should, that would be different. We should look at that. Yeah.
Yeah, great. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks.
Great. We have a few more questions. I think Trisha's got a request to see your other classic seminar, but maybe Trisha, you can ask your question and get some insights there.
Yeah, sure. Firstly, thank you for organizing this, Yadvinder, and the nice talk. It's very nice to hear about systems such as the Sholas, especially for folks who I can see in the call are from Bangalore and have worked in the Sholas. And for some people like me, I was born in Kunur. So this is dear to my heart. So frost, in like Atul's work, like frost is very specific to the Sholas, considering that they're montane systems. But what would you say, could you tell us briefly about the other disturbance regimes, basically fire and grazing in other savanna open ecosystems in India, such as the savannas in central India? So when thinking about like disturbance regimes and stuff like that.
Actually, thanks for bringing this up, because I should have made this point clearly in the talk, which is that even in the montane, even in the Shola grassland ecosystems, we think that frost will only be really important in the really high elevation ones, like the Nilgiris and the Palnis and the Anamalays, those big patches that you saw. You have to get about 1800 meters to get frost. But we do have the same very similar looking system that's below. You have it at 1400 to 1800, and certainly our experiment has not told us what's going on there. And there I would certainly guess, and I think Kate also had a comment, that there would be a role for fire and herbivory, and those effects might start to become important. But we need to go and do the experiments in those places. That's not been done. It's also very interesting because if you look at the composition of the Sholas going across the elevational gradient, you see a big switch in species composition of the Shola trees around that 1800 meter mark. And basically you've got very different lineages in the high elevation, and the composition lower is different. So there's a whole bunch of things that changes at 1800 meters, and things that drive the ecosystems below that should be different. So thanks for pointing that out. So frost is definitely for the high montane. In terms of what happens in the lowland, our plains, grasslands, and savannas, well, fire and herbivory have to be really important there. We could talk a lot about it, but yeah, they've got to be very important drivers in those systems. And if you look at fire maps of India and how much herbivory there is, and they are obviously important players in the system, and it would depend, where you are, which one's more important. Because we have the whole range from the nutrient poor to the nutrient rich, low herbivore to high herbivore, they're all there across the subcontinent. So you'd really have to start that down. Yeah, but they'd definitely be important.
Okay, thanks. I got that it's very like context specific then, and it varies by region, and hence doing some sort of, I don't know, a landscape like national level analysis would not give the entire picture, which is generally the case with most ecology studies. So
you should read a paper by Arastani et al. 2014, where he looks at how the different assemblages of herbivores, whether you've got the small-bodied ones or the large-bodied ones, and how they sort of map out across the subcontinent. But I should tell you, nobody's done it for fire. So if you want to do it, go for it.
Let's just say it's something I'm thinking about. I think Nikki Stevens is also on the call, which I don't know, I've spoken to her about. But anyway, I've never spoken to Yadvinder about it yet, but thank you.
Yeah, just to follow up, Trisha is a PhD student and is interested in where is appropriate for forest and non-forest in India. So now you've had this video introduction,
Okay.
I encourage you to have a follow-up conversation about it. I think it'd be very good for you to talk a bit more about this.
Yes, would love to.
Great. Okay, Kate, you have a comment. Maybe you want to directly feed that in?
Sorry, I'm in the middle of making pizza.
That's fine.
How often that happens in seminars. Yeah, so no, it was just, it was interesting to hear about the situation in Angola, and absolutely wonderful to hear the talk there and see the situation and compare it with other places that many of us have actually been to. Like tropical Gabon has got these incredible mosaics too, and places in South Africa where we work, where I don't know if you've been to Sriamfolosi, again, where you're getting these patches. But then even thinking about elsewhere in South Africa, so down in the Cape, in the mountains, where you're getting these patches of forest and these drainage lines and these cliff lines. And that was just, in some of these places, I think fire does have an influence. But it seems like we kind of need to start putting all of these studies together and thinking collectively about, are there can we make sort of general conclusions about what's happening across some of these systems? I mean, some of them are very tropical, and clearly that frost is not an issue, but then in your high elevations, it looks like it's really important. It'd be quite fun to try and start sort of joining up some of these systems and trying to make generalizations. Sorry, I don't have a question. And I'm
that's great. Yeah, it would be great to see, where they fall out. I assume the relative importance of these different drivers is going to really change across the systems, and it would be really nice to see them mapped out like that, right?
Yeah,
and see if there's something you can predict about which one would be the primary driver.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Enjoy the pizza, Kate. I can see the seeds of a symposium emerging from these discussions. Very interesting to have something about trying to draw together these forest grassland mosaics and what drives and shapes them.
That'd be fun.
Yeah. Okay. We haven't got any more questions lined up in the chat box. If anybody else has any other questions or comments, feel free to just unmute and post them now.
Thanks. Can I just make one final comment? And I just want to say that, Yadvinder, thanks for asking me to talk. And the reason I want to talk about the Shola grasslands today was really because, I knew Bob and Tanya very well. Not very well, somewhat well, but for a very long time. And the point I want to make is not so much about Bob and Tanya per se, but, they were two people who decided to spend their entire lifetime in this one ecosystem. And as a consequence of that, they've had some really important insights to give us. And I just really want to say that the more I am in a country like India, and I look at how fragmented all our landscapes are, and how we've got these bits and bobs everywhere, the way I see conservation happening on the ground in the future in the country is if we have more people, like more Bob and Tanya's, more people who decide that this little place is something that I'm going to be in and protect. The problem with that is that even if you have a lot of young idealistic folks who would want to go and do that, the funding structure simply doesn't work. And I was really thinking about this, and I was thinking that conservation organizations need to really think about what it is that you want to do, especially in countries like the developing South, like India. We've got 4% of protected areas. That's it. Everything else is outside in these little handkerchiefs and pockets. There is no way any broad policies is going to protect it. We're going to need local people everywhere, and we need a funding system that's going to back them up. And that's just, it's really been on my mind. The more I see, I know people who are doing this in different parts of the country, and I was just, I was thinking globally, if we could put together a bunch of people who drive funding, but then talk about how there should be policy directed at supporting or making it easier for people to make these choices. Because you can't make that choice if you can't go and have a decent life doing it, right? Mm-hmm. So just wanted to put that out.
I call it the plant blindness of the funding agencies.
Oh, the plant blindness. Oh yeah, there's that as well.
Yeah, it is a plant blindness of the funding agency. They give a lot of fund for the tiger conservation. They give a lot of fund for snake conservation, but they never give a fund for the plant conservation.
This is true. But definitely the stepchildren.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, that's a very powerful message, important message. So I think thank you once again, Jayashree. And also it's fantastic to see so many friends and the global grassland community in this virtual forum. And this is one of the real strengths of these lockdown seminars, that we get a chance to get together in a way that actually is quite hard to do and see people and get a diversity of voices from around the world as well. That's fantastic.
Yeah. Thanks everyone, and good night from Bangalore. Bye.
Okay. Thank you. And we'll, if I can persuade Jayashree that her seminar was fantastic, which I think you can all do that, but we'll post it onto YouTube as well.
I'm going to have to see that, Yadvinder.
Which is interesting on seeing it first.
Fear of seeing myself on the screen, but yeah. Okay. All right.
Okay, great.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.